Good afternoon, everybody. Last session of the conference. My name's Nolan. I'm going to show you a demo of how to do infinite scrolling with Mura 7. The obligatory. Who saw my talk yesterday? Anybody? Okay, a couple of you. So I'm a freelance consultant. I do a lot of work with the Blue River guys as well as other web and mobile stuff. Is anyone local to Sacramento? None of you live around here? Okay. I run a local user group called Sac Interactive. We have a meeting this coming Wednesday. And I'm actually going to give an intro to Mura. I used to program video games for a few years before I started doing web and mobile stuff. Now I do lots of web and mobile stuff. And when I'm not busy doing web things, I'm a music junkie. I buy lots of CDs and buy lots of records. I am quite proud of my record collection. So here's kind of a quick agenda of what we're going to look at today. There's lots of new features in Mura 7 that make different facets of web development much nicer. We're going to look at some of the new content type folders and how those work briefly. I'm going to show you a couple of the display object things that have changed. That'll be a little bit of a repeat of what Steve Withington went over yesterday. Show you some stuff about the models folder and how to wire up a service in your app. I'll show you a couple of different things in Mura.js that have not been gone over yet, and then I'll show you how to put all of it together to build an infinite scroller into your website. I'm going to show you kind of a stripped down version of it here on my laptop. And then when we're done with that, I'll show you an actual version of the exact same thing that's on a real live in production website you can go to out in the world and check that out if you want to. So here's the final result of what we're going to build, or what I'm going to show you how to build here in the talk today. I'm a big music junkie. David Bowie is my all-time favorite. Here's a list of David Bowie songs. And you notice the scroll bar over here on the right. Is it visible up there? Yeah, it is. As I scroll down towards the bottom of the page, look in the lower left corner, right above this little folder icon right here, and you'll very briefly, as the scroll bar gets towards the bottom of the page, you'll see the little black arrows that spun around briefly, and then the scroll bar extended, and I've got even more content on the page now, just like Facebook or Twitter would do if you swipe up the page. And I scroll down a little bit more, and it will probably flicker and do that animation again. There it is briefly. It's all running super fast because it's all on my laptop. There's not very much internet lag, but you get that same phenomenon, and that's how it's loading up all of the different material until it gets down to the bottom of my content. I've got about 7 pages worth of stuff, and after the 7th one, it will show you actually the bottom of the page if you have an end to your content. So that's what we're going to look at. All of the code and slides for this is all on GitHub. If you downloaded the repo yesterday, I made about 50 changes to it between yesterday and today. So I'd recommend re-downloading everything to get the latest and greatest. There's all the slides for my talk yesterday, the talk today. All the code I'm going to show you today is all up there in the repo, as well as a brand new Mura site bundle. So you can just grab a bundle of this website here and get everything with all the lyrics already loaded in, all the display objects that I've wired up, all the fake pages. You can just grab the site bundle, import it into your dev site, and be ready to go if you want to check that out. All right, so let's take a look at some of the new content type stuff. In Mura 7, they made it so that you've always had subtypes. So I can go into class extensions, and you can make different subtypes. You have your main types, page, and whatever the other ones are, and you can make subtypes. So here I've made a variation of a page called song listings. And here in my content, I have one page called Infinite Scrolling Demo, and I've made that page of type song listing. So over in your code, here in my theme, we've got a folder called Content Types. And you can have custom markup for each subtype by just go into your Content Types folder and name a folder with the convention of type _ subtype, put an index.cfm file in there, and that is the markup. You can see David Bowie Forever at the top. That will actually appear when you go to run that page on the site. So there's the actual custom markup. And so you can just make different variations of that. And that proves pretty useful for if you have like one particular section of your site you want to have infinite scrolling. You can make like an infinite scrolling subtype of a page, as that's the launch point where you drop a couple of display objects into that page that start the infinite scrolling process, or however you want to do it. So next thing they did a lot of retrofitting to in Mura 7 were the display objects. You've always had that display underscore objects folder. You can put them in the site level, the theme level, and you can put them in your plugins as well. They did a lot of retrofitting to how the display objects work. So they're available in more spots now in Mura than they were before. They're a little bit more reusable as well, and there's the nice drag and drop interface that Steve showed late yesterday where you can have the configurator on the right-hand side and you can drag and drop items over from that way. So the basic gist of how to use a display object to start, that part is still the same. You need an index.cfm file, and that's what actually shows up on your screen when you run a display object. And you need a config XML file that's sort of the hook to make your display object visible inside Mura. And just to get everyone on the same page, in case you haven't built a display object from scratch before, I've got a display object called hello world right here with an index.cfm file in it, and you can see it just got some plain HTML, nothing crazy in there. And my config XML just has the name of the display object in it. There's nothing magic you have to do there. Just go back over here and show you an example of how that works. Load up my first display object. There it is in the page. You can add those into your content a number of different ways. This particular one, I'll show you. Just here's my display object. And all I did was I went into the page and used the Mura tag, the M tag right here, and used the DSP object, point to the name of that display object, hello world. And that's the code that actually appears on the screen. This is my first display object. Boom, there it is. Nothing terribly crazy. One thing you want to note about that is, although this is the line of code that our display object rendered on the screen, when you use DSP object to draw some sort of widget on your website, it wraps whatever the output is from that object with this particular div. You get a div with a class of Mura object on it in your output. And I'll go back here to my browser and show you that just to prove that I'm not lying to you. Right click on it and then just shrink this down a little bit so we can see what we're looking at. Inspect element. I'm going to make this smaller so I can see in here. So there's my display object, and you can see there's that div with the class of Mura object content, and then right above that is the one we're actually interested in, this div here with the class of Mura object. And you can see on that same div there are a handful of other data attributes that got added. Whenever you call DSP object on a thing, the output gets wrapped with this, and you get the name of the object here, you get an instance ID. So if I had the same object 4 different times on the page, they'd all have 4 different instance IDs so that Mura can tell them apart from each other. And there's a couple of other baked in properties here that you may or may not find useful for whatever it is you're doing. We'll touch bases on those a little bit more. But the important thing here is to note that you render a display object, you get a div around it with a class of Mura object. Every time you call a display object, you'll get that output. And we can use that as a way to hook into that display object once it's rendered on the screen, right here, and actually manipulate it with JavaScript after it's already been drawn out on the screen. So we're going to play with that some as we do our infinite scrolling as well. Another thing you can do with display objects, Steve talked about this a little bit yesterday, is we've got that object params structure. You can put different parameters inside object params. It works sort of like the attribute scope does on Cold Fusion custom tags. If you've ever used written custom tags before, you can say object params dot first name and then set something to first name in your configurator on the right-hand side of Mura admin, or of the front-end editor. You can also write code to manipulate that as well. I'll show you a real quick sample of how that works. Go back here and we'll take a look at, here is the actual page in Mura. And you can see I'm just doing, what am I doing for this one? I think we have I did something a little bit different for this one. Yeah, I think this one has its own theme page is what I did, just to be silly and render things out a different way. Layout? Yes, so this one I put everything in a layout template, which you don't have to do. It was just another way to show how to load a display object. So here's my code. You can see I have a structure. I set a property inside that structure to artist name, called artist name. I set it to Green Day. Here's the output of my component, display object with parameters. I've got a div with a DSP object inside it, And in there I have a display object called listen to widget. Here's my listen to display object. And you can see I'm passing that myArg structure into the object params parameter in there. Here's my listen to widget code. Very simple. I really recommend you listen to, and then it just takes whatever we passed in as the artist name and draws it out on the screen. I'll go over here and show you the output of that. There's my output, and this one's not going to have any headers or footers around it, but the important thing is it does actually grab that parameter from a more parent-ish CFM template and passes it into the display object, and we're able to manipulate it. So far so good, nothing terribly crazy there. Next thing you can do, this is new to Mura 7, is inside each display object, you can have what they call a model folder. And that's where, if you've heard people talk about auto wiring and beans and dependency injection and DI1 and that sort of thing, the model folder is where you can put your CFCs that handle all of your behind-the-scenes business logic, your services. You can have one of those inside your site directory, your theme directory, and now you can have them inside each display object as well. It can have its own model folder where you can put however many CF components you want in there. And when you first load up Mura, Mura will check all of those model folders and auto-load all of those CFCs up, make them available in your app. You don't have to do any, if you saw my talk yesterday, I had that declare bean and check schema code and the declare bean statements at the top of my demos. That was because my CFCs were not in a /model folder that Mura finds automatically and loads it up. If you make a display object, make a model folder inside it, Mura will automatically do that, so you don't have to add your declare bean stuff anywhere. So I'll show you a sample of how that works. And we're going to link all of these things together to do the infinite scrolling. That's why I'm walking you through each of these pieces. So here's my display object with a model. And you can see it's just a regular page in Mura, just like the other ones. I'm using DSP theme include just to go to a file here in my theme, right there. I'm just loading the DSP object up. In this case, I've got one called punk band generator. You go into that widget. Here's my DSP, here's my display object. You can see inside that object, I've got a model folder with a component called punk band service. And it's got a method in there called get random punk band. I just have a list of different punk rock bands. It picks one at random and hands it back to my calling block of code. I save that as a variable called str band name. I'm an old Java guy, so I prefix all of my variables out of habit. And then I can just draw that variable right there on the screen in my display object, and it shows up on the page. So go back here to Mura, and I'll show you how to load that object up. You can see there's my random punk band. It shows MXPX, and I just rendered the date at which point in time it actually drew that content on the screen as a separate thing to show on the output. So you can see that it is actually changing every time I refresh the page, and that'll come in a little bit handy in the next demo that we're going to take a look at. I'm back here, run thing real quick in the demo. You notice all I had to say to get that, to get my service to be usable here in my display object was I just had to say get bean. I guess a more proper way to do it would be $get bean to make sure that I'm getting to the Mura scope, but it just it went through the scopes behind the scenes and found it in the dollar scope and used it. But I probably should have it say $get bean to be more proper, if you will. Close some of these so I don't get confused. All right, so let's switch gears now and talk about Mura.js. That's the new JavaScript client-side functionality that they've built into lots of different pieces of Mura 7. It's sort of the quasi-replacement for jQuery. I say quasi-replacement because it doesn't do everything jQuery does. It does the things that Mura admin needed jQuery to do, and it stops right about there. So, and you'll see in one of the later demos I do that we'll actually do some stuff in jQuery and some stuff in Mura.js, and I'll show you like these are places where I couldn't get Mura.js to do what I needed to do, and so we tacked on jQuery. And so it does the basic things like selecting DOM elements. You can do like on-click and on-hover and some of the default events and so on. There's an M scope. You've seen that in a few of the demos already this week. On the client side, it's basically the same as the Mura dollar scope in ColdFusion. And like I said, Mura uses the Mura.js stuff instead of jQuery. Internally, you can still add jQuery to your sites. I do that all the time. You can mix and match between the two. None of the code cares. One of the nice things, though, about Mura.js that's specific to Mura.js is it includes JavaScript functions that will manipulate your Mura display objects from once they've already been rendered on your screen. You can still go into those and update them, blank one out from the screen, replace it with new content, and flip things back and forth. And that's the trick that we're going to use in Mura.js to get an infinite scrolling effect to happen in your website. There's a couple of functions baked into Mura.js that help make that happen. There's one called empty. That basically means after I have a display object rendered on the screen, I can get a hook to that display object or whatever real estate it takes up on my screen, and I can just remove it from the screen, blank it out. I can actually get a reference to those metadata attributes that we saw in the earlier demo, and I can pull values out of those. I can add new parameters to that and update them. And there's also a method called append display object that basically lets me rerun a display object a second time on the screen even after my ColdFusion page is already finished being drawn on the screen. And I'll show you how that works right now. So here is back here in regular Mura land. I'm just going to load up a regular page. And you can see I'm not doing anything fancy, just including a starting CFM file. So we have a starting point for our code. Here I've got a display object at the top of the page. I'm loading that same punk band generator that we looked at in the earlier demo. And I've just got a couple of buttons on the screen below that. We'll take a look at that in a moment. And I've got some JavaScript here that we'll take a look at too. So here's the page in action. Load my Mura.js functions up. And there's the punk band that it generated. You can see this time it picked operation Ivy. And every time I hit the refresh button, it refreshes just this section of my page. You can see I have a slightly different timestamp now. Whenever I hit that, it is actually updating this piece of my page in real time when I hit that. If I want to just blank out that display object entirely, I can just hit empty the display object and it kills it from the screen entirely. Not terribly exciting, but I'm actually, when I hit refresh, I'm actually doing the empty first and then re-rendering a new instance of that display object behind the scenes right here. And it's pretty easy to do that. Here's our code for that page. Here's the actual display object drawing the punk band at the top of the page. Here's my two buttons. The empty button runs a block of code. You'll notice down here I'm not using the jQuery $document.ready that we've all seen 1,000 times. I'm using the Mura equivalent of that for the Mura.js stuff. Set in a couple of variables that just point to not the wrapper div that I have around my display object, but as we noted earlier, when you call a display object, it's going to wrap whatever content comes out of there with a div with a class of equal to Mura object. So I'm just using this wrapper as a way to get one level inside there and get to that div that has the class of Mura object, saving a reference to that. Then I'm turning on the asynchronous functionality of Mura.js. That's just telling the Mura system, I want to update this from the client side kind of at random whenever the page runs. Here's my code for that empty button, just when I want to clear that div, that display object off the screen, like that. It's pretty straightforward. When the button gets clicked, just don't do whatever click might have been there beforehand. Get a reference to the div on the outside and just call .empty, and it just wipes it out of the screen. Nothing terribly crazy there. Here's the refresh button. Slightly more complicated, but not a whole lot. You click the refresh button. We get a reference to that same outer wrapper container. And I'm just saving the metadata, all the data dash attributes into a variable for later use. Empty anything out of that display object, so wipe it out of the screen. And then I'm going to basically refresh that display object with a new instance on the page. So I'm taking all of the metadata attributes from what the display object looked like earlier and just saying, make a new copy of that display object that looks exactly the same as what it did before. But because the insides of that display object call that model service file that creates a random new band on the screen, whenever I load that up, it'll wipe out what's there and it'll refresh it with a new instance of the code. So I have three things here. Save a copy of what the display object looked like before, blank out that div so that we can give it a fresh new copy of whatever I wanted earlier. And we'll play with this data attribute a little bit more in the next example. But 3 lines of code to get a little kind of reusable section here, and you notice that when I do it, it real briefly shows you that circular black arrow spinning thing, showing that it's refreshing that portion of the page. That happens automatically anytime you do this kind of functionality in Mura with these Mura.js functions. I don't have to write any code to make that little animation happen. Although I'll show you how you can customize that if you want to make it something more branded to your company or whatever too. Another method that is useful in Mura.js for building display objects and having changing variations of it as your site progresses or as people click buttons or whatever on your site is the extend attribute. So what the extend will let us do is kind of capitalize on the data and append display object methods we looked at earlier. It'll say make a copy of, take the metadata from what the display object looked like earlier and clone a new instance of that display object. So give it a brand new instance ID. So as far as Mura is concerned, it's a new display object on the screen. We can then take whatever metadata we want from the previous display object, pass it into the new one to set default parameters or whatever, and we can also add new values to that display object and pass new values in so it can do slightly more complex things. And I'll show you a copy of how that would work right now. So I'll go into our back end, load up the next version of our page. And same thing here. I'm not doing anything super weird in Mura admin. I'm just including a starting point file. Here's what that file looks like. Very similar HTML setup at the top of the page. I have, in this case, we have some code that draws a Beatles song suggestion on the screen. Load it up. We recommend you listening to 8 days a week. And if I load the page up again, you can see it'll pick a random song every time you render the page. Instead of 2 buttons on the screen like I had in the last demo, I've got a box here where you can recommend another song, and you can append the new suggestions to the output of the page. So like here, if I wanted to recommend you also listen to Sgt. Pepper, and hit append. So Mr. Kite is currently on the page. Watch what happens now. It doesn't actually blank out what was there before. It just draws a new copy of the display object right below it with this additional bit of data on the screen. The way I'm doing that is back here's where we started off. Here's our starting CFM template that got theme included. And I'm going to my Beatles song suggestion display object. That's right here, Beatles song suggestion. Code looks like this. He has his own model folder with a Beatles service CFC inside it. And there's a method in there called getBeatlesSong that works real similar to the Punk Band one does from before. Has a list of a bunch of Beatles songs that just returns a random one back to the calling block of code. So you could, of course, replace this with SQL queries or whatever your real-world application is that it has to do. So here in my display object, I'm calling getBean and getting an instance of that Beatles service, calling getBeatlesSong, saving the results out to a variable. Real similar to the first version we saw. This one, though, has got this object params attribute additional suggestion tacked onto the top of it here with a default of nothing. If it got passed in a value for that additional suggestion object param value, it will also draw this and we also think you'd like and whatever the suggestion is on the screen. And that's what we're seeing right here. And we'd also think you'd like Sgt. Pepper. Remember how we talked in the first demo about when you, so I'm clicking on this first display object here where it outputted for the benefit of Mr. Kite. And we're going to take a look at the markup for that. Here is the HTML. Here's the div that surrounds that display object when it outputs. Here's div class Mura content object. And here's all those data attributes that we saw before with the instance of this particular copy of the display object on the screen. You'll notice that it's also got this data attribute. This is new to this display object. It's got one called additional suggestion, data-additional suggestion, which matches the name of that object params thing. If you're in a display object, anything you say object params dot whatever the name is, when it renders that out to the screen, you'll get that parameter as data dash whatever that name is. It'll actually save it out to the client side. In this case, it was just the first time it ran, so it gives the default value of whatever I put here, which is nothing. So I don't have anything in there for this particular instance. But when we hit our append suggestion box and it drew a second display object on the screen below it, we can see down here, I'll click on this one, inspect. We can see that this display object below it also has a class of Mura object wrapped around it, and his additional suggestion parameter is in fact set to whatever I typed into that box previously. You'll also notice that the instance ID number here for this Sgt. Pepper version is different than the one up above. So I'll close that. Come on. All right, that's too squirrely to get there. This one ends in 051, and you can see this one ends in 5B9. So it is, in fact, creating a new instance of that display object every time you call the JavaScript to make it run. So let's take a look at that JavaScript. So back here in the calling template where we started this, created our object, wrapped it with an ID of JS Beatles wrapper. And when I click the append button, here's the Mura.js code that runs. Click that button. I've got a line of JavaScript here that just says go to the wrapper that I put at the top of the page around that display object. Go find the thing inside it with the class of Mura object, and just in case there's been multiple of those already run, go get the last one at the bottom. So the last child just grabs the bottom one. When a page first starts up, there's only one, so it's going to grab that one. Save a reference to that, turn on the Mura.js asynchronous stuff so that this all works. And now when I click the button, grab a copy of all those data dash attributes and save them for later. Just use Mura.js the same way you would use jQuery to go get whatever's in that text box on the screen that I have up here called other suggestion. I type Sgt. Pepper in there. It grabs the value out of that box, saves it to my variable, and then I'm going to use the Mura.js function extend. This is take a copy of that original metadata from the first display object, and I'm going to stick a new parameter in there that wasn't there before. If we don't already have a parameter in here called additional suggestion, make one, and then stick whatever I typed into that text box into that value. So we've now made a new copy of it, and it puts all that stuff back into my variable myData. Then I can take that myData value, pass it into append display object, and that's where it's going to actually create a new copy of the display object, refresh that portion of the screen, and stick it into the bottom of the app. And that's why when I go back over here and I run this a third time yesterday, it'll keep display objects 1 and 2 there, and it creates a new third one that runs, and these all three would have entirely new instances of each other all down the page. So I can obviously create new instances of display objects by clicking a button, or you can create it by running any other JavaScript event you want in the app. If I moved my mouse over a particular portion of the page, make more display objects appear. If I scroll down the page, make more display objects appear as they go. And each time the display object runs, it's got its own service model backend functionality baked inside there. We can have that new display object as it appears. It automatically runs whatever's in that CF component behind the scenes and fires off another database call to grab the next set of articles you want to have appear on your front page, or the next set of, in our case, David Bowie lyrics that are going to come flying up the page, or the next set of friend updates in your Facebook news feed if you're building a Facebook version of this. That's how we would hook all those things together. So let's look at putting these things together. So we've got the content types folder, so we can make subtype specific markup. So we have a launching page for everything we want to start with. We know how to make display objects that have their own model folder. So you can put backend logic that is specific to a display object in the same spot as your display object. And we know how to pass parameters into the object params scope, both from the server side, and we can also do it from the client side by just setting different parameters in JavaScript, using that extend attribute and passing values for specific properties into that object param, or creating them in this structure here, and they automatically get added to your object params structure when this runs and creates a new instance of the display object for you. And then inside your display objects, you just say object params dot, not that one, this one. You say object params dot whatever the thing is, and as long as that property name matches files to get them out of my way. All right, so now I'm going to go back here to our content types, and let's take a look at the infinite scrolling version that puts all this stuff together for us. I'm going to refresh the site just to say I did. Go to the infinite scrolling demo. So the page first starts. I have not moved the mouse anywhere. The scroll bar is still at the top of the page. Let's take a look at the page song listing code. Here's the output at the top, David Bowie Forever, and my div around this list of songs. Inside that, I've got a display object called infinite scroller, and I've got a handful of JavaScript down below that. We'll get into that in just a moment here. So inside my infinite scroller, that's just a regular display object like any of the others we've been looking at. Here's my infinite scroller. Config XML doesn't have anything exciting in there. There's no tricks to this. In our index.cfm, we've got the same object parameters we looked at earlier. There's just a couple more of them. We've got one that just keeps track of how many songs should appear on the page each time you scroll down and start the infinite scrolling to refresh. I've got it set to 10. A couple other items in here that just, if I wanted to add sorting, so I can sort the songs alphabetically or A to Z or Z to A, I've got a couple properties in there to do that. We don't need those either. And I've got a parameter in here for showing the current page. So each time I make a new instance of the display object, I need to be able to pass into that new instance which page is this display object going to be drawing on the screen. If I've got the same display object 4 times, it's going to be 4 different instances of that display object. Well, the first instance draws page 1's worth of stuff. The second instance needs to be told, don't draw page 1, draw page 2, and it's going to draw that version of the code. And that's what I'm using current page for here. So when it first loads the page, current page is set to 1. I can show you that when I go in here and click on this element. And you can see we'll look at, not that one, here's my song container. And right inside there I'll have a div with a class of Mura object. I'll make this a little bit bigger so we can see in there better. Like that. Oh, come on. There we go. There's Mura object. And I've got number of, it'll keep track of the number of pages for me. I've got a property in object params for that. And there's data-current page is set to 1. You can see that there are no other Mura object divs inside this container. If I scroll down, there's just that one currently, and then there's a bunch of script code below that. So I'm going to scroll down past 10 songs, and what I've got this block of JavaScript here. There's a little bit of extra stuff in here to handle when the window, we talked about how you can run JavaScript when you click on a thing or when you drag your mouse over items or whatever. I've got code here that just keeps track of when you scroll up and down on the page, run this function called window scroll handler. That's this guy here. Every time you inch your mouse down a tiny little bit, it fires off a scroll event. I don't want to move my mouse 10 times and have all 10 pages appear back to back on the site. I want it to only show the next piece of content when I've scrolled near-ish the bottom of my browser window. So I've got a little bit of math in here that all it's doing is checking for, is the footer of the site about to become visible on the page? Then I'm near the bottom of the page. It's now time to actually draw the next display object on there. So a little bit of funky looking math here, but it's not for anything other than, it's not for anything display object related, it's just to make kind of a smooth UI process happen for the users. So when it is in fact time to load, we've scrolled to the point where we should render stuff on the screen, stop looking for the scrolling event, turn that off momentarily, use the same Mura selector that we used before to grab that song container div on the page, find the Mura object thing inside it, get me the very last one, get a copy of whatever metadata is in there and save that off. If we're not on the very, very last page yet, if there's still more pages of stuff we can show on the screen, then go ahead and set current page to the next page. We're going to call that same Mura extend property that we had before. And I'm going to just pass in the same song count per page property, set it to 10. That's going to set this object params, song count per page, to 10. You can see it defaults there, but I could override it if I wanted to. I'm going to take current page, which we updated here. So we went from 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 or whatever. I'm going to pass that into the display object as another parameter. And I've got this infinite scroll flag to turn on. In the real world example I'll show you later, we actually had a feature on the site where they could turn infinite scrolling on and off. So I just have a flag in here to do that as well. So set all my properties into the extend function, get my selector back to that apparent div and say we're going to refresh the thing that's inside there with this new metadata that we passed in. And then this append display object method returns a promise. So once it's done refreshing that display object, you can have other blocks of JavaScript that fire afterward. If you have different sections of your page that need to maybe update in sequence, or after I update this piece here, maybe you've got like a subtotals column off to the side. You want to have those numbers reflect the changes in the display object. You can then do that with the JavaScript promise that this returns. In this case, I'm just using the promise to turn the code back on that watches to see if I've scrolled again on the page. So once we've scrolled to the point where the display object is doing the next piece of infinite scrolling, it turns off. We turn off the scroll handler. When it's done processing that display object, we turn the scroll handler back on so we can continue looking for the user scrolling down further. And that's what this is doing here. The pieces down here at the bottom are just setting a couple variables that point to that div that I'm using elsewhere in the site, just to turn on the asynchronous behavior. And I'm setting a default value of, start the site on page 1 when you first load it up. And then here's the code that just starts looking for that scroll event when the page first loads. So there's not a whole lot of different stuff in this fancy infinite scrolling display object that wasn't in the previous examples. We just combined the things we looked at in the smaller display objects and put them all into one right here. So we've got, oh, and here's our model that we're using inside the display object. We have a song service. And then in this case, I've got real live content in the database. Here's my list of, we've got a different page for every, for like 60 or 70 different David Bowie songs. Some have lyrics, some don't. Some have him as the author, some say associated staff. So the content all varies a little bit, but there's quite a bit of it. Just to show you that I'm not lying to you, I'll go over here into Mura and show you. Here's a folder called Songs. Zoom in there. And there's a whole mess of stuff. You can see I've got several pages worth of content. So we go back here to infinite scrolling. The page first loads up. There's the first 10 records that it came back with when this function ran, or when this query ran. Here's our infinite scroller. We made an instance of our song service, created some arguments, copy of the Mura scope, the site ID that we're currently on, content parent ID. This is all stuff specific to my song service. You don't have to use these parameters. What these are doing is just telling it, here's a copy of Mura, here's the site that I'm actually dealing with in the database, and then my content parent ID is just saying, don't draw all of the content on the screen, only draw the content that lives inside this song folder. So I'm just using this to say, go get content in the song folder and go get that content ID. I want to draw everything in there. That's what my infinite scroller is going to render. Call the getSongs method with those arguments, and it comes back with a song iterator. Song service looks like this. It's one big, giant SQL query. Your mileage may vary. This may or may not be the query that you want to run. When it's done running that plain SQL query, I just use the content iterator and stick rs is the record set from this SQL query. So just take whatever that query is and stuff it into a regular Mura content iterator. That's what that function is going to return. There's nothing else in that entire component. So go in here, comes back with a song iterator. I can then use setNextN and setPage in the song iterator, and I can pass how many songs appear per page, so how many songs should appear each time I do the next chunk of infinite scrolling, and what page am I currently on, 1, 2, 5, or whatever. The iterator will figure out, okay, if the record set had this many things in it, he now wants to draw songs 40 through 41, or 40 through 50, or whatever you set it to. And then I just figure out the total number of pages to save that for later use as well. We use object number of pages in the client side to figure out, once we're at the bottom of the page, are there more pages of content that we should be showing, or have we actually reached the bottom of the site and should just show the site footer instead? So that's why I have a parameter for number of pages. And then here's the output that shows up. Every time that display object runs, loops over my song iterator and draws a little bit of pretty basic bootstrap output on the screen, just so you can see there's a song title in a panel. And if I had a summary for that song, it'll actually draw the song summary on the screen as well. That's what these little blue and white panels are here, and you can see as I scroll down towards the bottom, it will automatically hit that refresh where it draws 10 more songs, and I scroll down a little bit more, it automatically does it again, and there's 10 more, and it will keep doing that for, I think I've got about 6 or 7 pages worth of stuff here in the site until it gets to the very end of those items, and there I am at the bottom of my site footer. I'm out of content. All right, so that's the neat little cute sample, but pretty sure none of your bosses have called you and said, I really want you to build a site that lists all of some heavy metal band songs on the, on the web. Here's a check. That probably doesn't happen. What did happen for us a while ago, so I do a lot of work with the Blue River folks. I'm a consultant, work with them and some other outfits. We built a site for the Intuit folks called firmofthefuture.com. This launched a couple of months ago. And just to show you that this is not just some proof of concept thing that you cannot actually use in the real world, other than building sites that list Beatles and David Bowie lyrics, you can actually come here to this real site and you can view content by pages. You can just scroll down to the bottom of a page and you can paginate through content just like you normally would, or you can go here and I'm just going to refresh the page to start from scratch so you know that I'm not doing any trickery to you. You can also click View All, and that turns on the same infinite scroller that I just showed you with slightly more chrome around it right here. You can see here's content, and as I get towards the bottom of the footer, it will run that little, you can see the little rectangle animation in the middle there, and boom, I have another set of articles down below that on the site. And as I scroll down further, in this case I only have 2 pages of content, but it did in fact do that. Let me see if I can find a page that has more stuff. Go over here to client advising. That sounds exciting. Let's see if they have a lot of stuff there. 51 results. Okay, we'll try this. All. And there's page 1, there's page 2. There's another page. It's going to churn for a minute. And there's another set. So it does actually do more infinite scrolling as you go. You notice that they had a little different animation than I did. They had the rectangles that bounce up and down. I have the little spinner off to the side. None of that requires custom JavaScript to do it. You can go into your site. And one of the things that turns on when you turn on the asynchronous client-side stuff is go into your site or your themes, content renderer CFC, and right near the top there is this .preloader markup. And you can see that's just set to some block of HTML. In this case, it's using a couple font awesome icons to make a little spinner that draws itself, and that's what I'm using on my site to draw the little black arrows in the corner that were spinning as I scrolled through all the David Bowie songs. You can see if I turn that one off and turn on a different version of it where I just have the words please wait in bold on the screen. If I go back here to my David Bowie one, reload that page from scratch, and now in the lower left corner, when I get down to the 10 songs, it'll only briefly show up, but you can real quickly see it says please wait in the lower left corner there. It's flickering like super fast, but I promise you it's working. So all you have to do if you want to customize that animation is go in here to your content renderer and change the HTML to whatever it is that you'd like it to be. You could point to a bigger chunk of code or add 20 different CSS classes to turn on animations and do whatever you want to do there to make it, branded to your site however you'd like it to be branded. So it does actually work in a real site. You can turn it on and off with JavaScript and do all that stuff. I did actually write the code we saw here along with Evan Dunham, who's running around giving talks as well right now. And that's kind of how you do infinite scrolling in Mura. Just use the new display objects and use the new append display object method and keep stacking new display objects on top of each other as scroll events happen in your site. It'll start pulling from your model on the back end. The model runs your SQL query. It grabs whatever the next chunk of stuff is out of your site and draws it on the screen. And you can combine those things and get a real-world infinite scroller into your site, just like Facebook and Twitter. Questions from anyone? No? Stunned silence? And just loves it? Yes?
Does that slow down your computer in any way? Like does Facebook and constantly scrolling infinitely, does it cause any slowdown?
Does it slow down your site?
Like if you have like thousands of pages, someone just decided to scroll all the way to the bottom.
Well, I guess that's kind of up to them. Like if I'm on Facebook for an hour and I just keep swiping up, that's up to me to, yeah, I would eventually end up with a page that could be, 800 pages long. I guess you could write further JavaScript to sort of do cleanup and content that's been rendered that is now really, really far up at the top of the page if I'm looking at stuff at the bottom. You could kind of write something that removes items from the top of the page to make the DOM smaller, and you can do that. I didn't in this case. Nobody had asked for that in this functionality.
It'd just be like a reverse of that right there.
Yeah, basically. Like instead of using, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. What were you going to say?
It was just like a reverse of what you're doing on the bottom.
Yeah, pretty much. You could look for when people scroll down, add more stuff. When people scroll up, put them back at the top. And as they scroll down, instead of using that Mura object : last child to get to the last one that was rendered, use Mura object first child to get to the first one. And you could just call .empty and move that out of the DOM so that it's smaller. And yeah, you can do variations of that if you wanted to. Yeah.
If it does cause this, I wasn't aware if it does or not.
Technically, it probably does. For sites like Facebook and Twitter, my personal thought is that's kind of just up to the user. If they want to keep scrolling and adding more stuff, if their site eventually runs slow, well, don't do that. That kind of falls in the category of, hey, it hurts when I punch myself in the head a bunch. Well, if you stop doing that, it won't happen anymore. If I was building something more like a mobile app or a video game where I needed to keep performance really, really top-notch and really performant, then I might worry about, okay, have we used this object in the last 2 minutes? No, go ahead and remove it from the screen to save memory and whatever. But yeah, you could. I don't have a demo of that, though. Anything else? No? All right. Everything's up on GitHub if you want to grab it and check it out. Slides, the code demo, the site bundle, the whole bit. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the conference.